Family secrets. Bastard discovered his millionaire father's dark secret and paid the ultimate price. Imagine the following situation. You live your life believing a lie, until one day your mother makes a bombshell revelation about your father. A dark secret, kept for years, comes to light, and suddenly everything you thought you knew about your identity falls apart. The protagonist of our story finds himself at the center of a devastating family drama, where his millionaire father's past is not only surprising, but capable of changing his destiny forever. Are you ready to find out how far he will go to deal with his father's legacy and the devastating truth that changed everything? Stay until the end and see what he will do when faced with the consequences of the revelation that turned his life upside down. Luke always believed his life was simple. He grew up in a modest house with his mother, Laura, who always made a point of keeping him away from the world of power. It was a calm routine, without any major surprises. But that night, his mother's revelation would come to upend everything he thought he knew about his own life. Laura, in a tense voice, said that the man he thought was his father was nothing more than a facade. His real father was a much more powerful man, Edward, a billionaire. The weight of the news fell on Luke like a bomb. Laura said that Edward's death was recent, which meant that he was now entitled to an inheritance. The shock was so great that he almost couldn't process the words. How could this be? He had never known anything about the man who now seemed responsible for his origins. Laura, with a look full of concern, explained that she had hidden it for so long, believing that he was better off not knowing. But now, the secret needed to be revealed. The impact of the news transformed the environment, the silent room became heavy, and Luke felt his world spinning. That night dragged on for Luke. His mind couldn't absorb the enormity of what he had just heard. What did this mean for him now? He was about to be thrust into a world he barely knew, a world of power, wealth, and intrigue. The idea of inheriting a fortune left him with a feeling of discomfort. He wanted to know whether he should accept that inheritance or continue with the simple life he had always known. The dilemma was clear: live the luxurious life that would open up before him, or stay with his mother and continue life as he had always done, away from the danger and greed that now revealed itself before him. Laura looked at him with a sad expression, as if she knew this decision would be more difficult than any other he had ever made. She told him that Edward's will would not be simple. There were requirements he would have to meet to claim the inheritance. But there was something else she didn't want to tell. Laura's words haunted him. Inheritance isn't just money, Luke. It's a burden. Before I continue, have you ever felt at a crossroads like this? Leave a comment below and share your own experiences with difficult decisions. Let's talk about it. As the night progressed, Luke couldn't escape the whirlwind of thoughts that invaded him. He thought about how happy he had been with his simple life, without the need for riches to be happy. But now, with the revelation that his biological father had been a billionaire, he was on the verge of a difficult choice. How could someone as ordinary as him make a decision about something so big? He found himself reflecting on the weight of his past and the uncertain future that was about to be traced. The discomfort was growing, as if he were on the verge of falling into an abyss he didn't know how to avoid. The simple life with his mother seemed safer, but now he understood that this security came with a price. His biological father, although distant, had left him an inheritance that, more than just money, gave him a new path to follow. But in accepting this wealth, he would also have to deal with the consequences of a story and a family he had never imagined. The feeling of failure, of losing control of his own life, was immense. He wanted to escape everything, but he knew that with Edward's death, the choices would no longer be his, and the burden of inheritance would come with him. The letter Laura gave Luke was full of details about the inheritance, but between the lines, there was something he couldn't fully understand. His mother's words echoed in his mind, but even with all the explanation, Luke felt that there was something dark behind it. Laura spoke about his father in a distant manner, with a look full of concern. The death of Edward, the billionaire he never met, was shrouded in mystery, and his mother, without giving further explanation, feared that Luke would be seduced by the temptations of a world he had never imagined. The inheritance seemed to be just the tip of the iceberg, something superficial, but there was a hidden weight that was not revealed. She didn't want to scare him, but she knew that by accepting wealth, he would also accept a burden, something he still didn't fully understand, but that would certainly change everything around him. The truth was between the lines, but he needed to see beyond what seemed simple. Over the next few weeks, Luke couldn't shake his obsession with the inheritance. He imagined how his life could be different, easier, more full of luxuries and opportunities. But at the same time, the knowledge that there was a price to be paid for all this tormented him. The idea of entering this world of intrigue, where everyone seemed to fight for power and control, scared him. The wealth that came with the inheritance was an irresistible temptation, but he knew that by accepting it, he would be entering into something far greater than he could ever control. What was really hidden in that inheritance? What else would he need to do to prove he deserved it? He wondered if he was prepared to face the risks that came with wealth. The fear of being manipulated, of being drawn into a dangerous game, took over his thoughts. He needed answers. But the clues were few and the doubts were many. Luke's life until that moment had been marked by simplicity. The small apartment where he lived with his mother was his refuge, away from the hustle and bustle of big cities and the pressures of the financial world. But now, that tranquility seemed like an illusion. He found himself increasingly drawn to the stories of wealth and power he had heard from his mother and others. However, every time he thought about entering this world, a deep discomfort enveloped him. How could he, someone so simple, adapt to that complex reality full of dangers? What would he lose of himself by embracing wealth? Every step he took toward deciding on his inheritance made him ask himself, was he ready to play this game? Was he willing to give up simplicity for a life of temptation and manipulation? Doubt gnawed at him, but he knew he needed to understand what was at stake before it was too late. The risk of losing his soul to power was too great to ignore. On a rainy afternoon, Luke received a piece of mail that would change his destiny even further. The envelope, yellowed and with a familiar seal, arrived in his hands as a sign that the situation was about to get complicated. It was from a lawyer, the same one who handled Edward's will. Upon opening it, Luke found his father's will, which not only listed the assets he would inherit, but also a series of conditions he would have to fulfill to be entitled to the legacy. The first of these conditions disconcerted him. He needed to prove that he was capable of handling what his father had left for him. But what exactly did aptitude mean? It wasn't enough to have the legal right. He needed to demonstrate that he deserved it. This left Luke with a feeling of apprehension. He knew that by delving into the requirements, he could be entering dangerous territory. But the temptation to discover what else was behind this drove him to investigate further. However, what he didn't know was that this decision would put him at risk in ways he had never imagined. As the days went by, Luke's curiosity led him to investigate more about Edward's past. He dug up old documents and began interviewing people who had some connection to his father. What started as a simple search for information soon turned into an alarming discovery. Edward's death was not an accident as everyone had believed. He was murdered. As the pieces of the puzzle fell into place, Luke realized there were people willing to stop him from claiming his inheritance. His father, now deceased, had been involved in a power game so great that his choices and alliances could be fatal for anyone trying to get involved. Luke began to question whether he really wanted that legacy. His father's power and wealth were surrounded by danger and betrayal, and he began to understand that Edward's enemies were now his enemies too. The temptation of inheritance was mixed with fear of consequences. Luke knew that by accepting this legacy, he would not only be inheriting material goods, but entering into a war of interests that could consume everything he knew. Luke's situation took an increasingly dark turn. As he delved deeper into his investigations, he realized there was no way back. His family's secrets were being revealed, but with each new discovery, he fell deeper into a maze of lies and conspiracies. He no longer knew who to trust, and as the dangers approached, he felt the weight of the choices he would have to make. People began to directly threaten him, saying that he should give up fighting for his inheritance. Edward's death was starting to make more sense, and as Luke uncovered the secrets, he understood that in trying to claim his legacy, he was exposing himself to an enemy far greater than any he could have imagined. The pressure was becoming unbearable, and he wondered if he had the courage to continue. With each new step he took towards the truth, he felt like he was going deeper into a hole with no way out. The risk of losing everything seemed imminent. Doubt consumed him. Would he have the courage to face what was coming? Luke's situation is desperate, but can he find a way out? Before you see how he reacts, enjoy this video if you're enjoying this journey of tension and mystery. Let's see what comes next. Luke received a direct warning from one of his father's rivals. The message, simple but threatening, was the turning point he hadn't expected. In it, the message was clear. He must give up claiming the inheritance or suffer the consequences. Edward's enemies had become his own. The warning spoke not only of the inheritance, but of the much deeper intentions of those who now had their eyes on him. They were willing to do anything to ensure that Luke abandoned his quest for fortune. But what was at stake was not just money. Edward's inheritance, it seemed, was a symbol of power, a power capable of changing the destiny of many people. Luke uncomfortably began to realize that he wasn't just dealing with the loss of a father he never knew. He was being thrust into a much bigger game, a game where the rules were unclear and the danger imminent. Now he was the target of something much bigger than he had imagined. That inheritance would not only be the key to a better life, but a burden he didn't know if he was ready to carry. Luke's dilemma intensified as he delved deeper into his investigations. He discovered Edward's old documents, confidential reports, and even letters from influential people who were somehow linked to the billionaire's death. The revelations became increasingly disconcerting. Luke began to question whether he was being manipulated from the beginning. It was as if each clue led him into a web of intrigue he could barely understand. Each new piece of information seemed to connect him to a network of secrets and lies. The tension within him increased as he realized he had no control over the situation. The quest for inheritance was becoming a quest for control over something much bigger than himself. His own future was in the hands of people he didn't even know, and the weight of that made him doubt whether he really should continue this journey. He wanted answers, but the more he dug, the more he got lost in the questions. Was he the protagonist of his own story, or was he being drawn into a game he didn't understand? The pressure of making the decision became increasingly unbearable. Luke found himself facing a crossroads where his choice would be irreversible. He could follow his father's path, claim the inheritance, and enter the game of power and corruption, or he could abandon everything and live a life away from all the complications that wealth would bring. But he knew this decision would not be easy. Inheritance offered power, but it also brought with it dangers he was beginning to understand. He wondered if he should risk everything for something he didn't yet fully comprehend. Every step he took seemed to carry him further away from his simple, safe life, while at the same time drawing him closer to a destiny full of uncertainty and risk. Doubt consumed him, and he began to realize that by accepting the power that the inheritance would bring, he would be putting not only his life but his mother's life at risk. The dilemma was real, and the choice was difficult. He no longer knew if he was making decisions on his own, or if he had become a pawn in the game of destiny. The threats against Luke became more real as the days went by. Anonymous letters, cryptic phone calls, and discreet meetings with shadowy figures became a constant in his life. He could no longer distinguish who his allies were, and who were just waiting for the right moment to attack. What seemed to be a simple inheritance now revealed itself as a true battle for survival. Every decision he made involved him more and more in a game of power and corruption, where he was just another moving piece. Doubt began to gnaw at his mind. Was he seeking this wealth out of ambition, or was he just trying to escape a life without prospects? The pressure was immense, and he no longer knew if he was making the right decisions. Each step took him further away from his simple life, and closer to something much bigger, but at the same time, much more dangerous. He knew he couldn't go back, but he also wondered if what he was looking for was really worth it. As he tried to piece together the puzzle of his father's true plans, Luke began to realize that not everyone was as they seemed. Some people he trusted, those who were closest, turned out to be more self-interested than he had imagined. Betrayals began to emerge, and with each new secret revealed, he became more suspicious. He discovered that many of these people were manipulating him to achieve their own goals, using him as a pawn in their game. The signs had been there all along, but Luke refused to believe them. He now found himself torn, not knowing who to trust. The manipulations were clear, but he was so immersed in the search for truth that he could no longer distinguish the line between what was right and what was convenient. Edward's legacy seemed to have turned into a prison, and Luke began to realize that to protect himself, he would have to follow in the same footsteps as his father, ally with the same enemies, or else he would be destroyed. But that would mean giving up his own morals, something he wasn't yet sure he was willing to do. Luke's internal battle intensified over time. He no longer knew what he wanted for himself. The idea of following his father's legacy, despite all the traps and manipulations, began to seem more and more attractive. The wealth he would inherit was not just financial, it also came with the power to change his life irreversibly. However, he could not ignore the dangers involved. Every move seemed to bring him closer to a trap, where the line between winner and loser became increasingly blurred. He wondered if it was really worth risking everything for something that, deep down, seemed empty and soulless. The simple life he once desired now seemed more distant than ever. And as he sank deeper into this power play, his enemies drew closer, making his situation more desperate every day. Doubt gnawed at him. Was he really ready for everything this inheritance brought? Or was he just running away from something he could never achieve? In the midst of so many conflicts, Luke found an unlikely alliance. It came from where he least expected. An old childhood friend, someone with whom he had shared few moments of his life, but who somehow had crucial information about what was happening with the inheritance and its enemies. Together, They began to unmask the dark forces gathering against him. With each new discovery, a way out seemed to form, a chance to escape this web of power and corruption. But there was something that didn't leave him completely at ease. Distrust always surrounded him, and he wondered if he could really trust this ally, someone from his past whose intentions were still a mystery. Deep down, he knew that this alliance could be his salvation or his biggest mistake, and the uncertainty of committing to a risky partnership made him doubt everything around him. While delving into the details of the alliance and the inheritance, Luke was confronted with the truth about his father. He discovered that Edward knew exactly what he would face, that the will had been prepared in advance, as if the billionaire knew that his son would have to fight for the inheritance in an unthinkable way. The conditions were grimmer than Luke had imagined. It was not just about providing for the needs of a financial legacy, but a power game where the winner would become something much more than simply rich. The revelations began to emerge slowly, like a waking nightmare. The truth that Edward left behind haunted Luke, but he knew he couldn't ignore it. He had to understand everything that was at stake before making any decision. Each new secret about Edward's past seemed to place more weight on his shoulders, yet at the same time guided him closer to the destiny his father had already set for him. When Luke finally believed he was ready to claim his due, the first major obstacle appeared. It was a powerful enemy that revealed itself, someone who had already overthrown those who came before, and who was willing to destroy everything Luke had already achieved. This enemy didn't just want the inheritance, he wanted to control everything, and he knew that to do so, Luke would have to be removed. The situation was now critical. Luke was faced with a choice imposed by circumstances: fight against this overwhelming force and secure his inheritance, or flee and abandon everything, leaving his legacy behind. But he knew that by making either choice there would be no turning back. The tension he felt was almost unbearable. He was at the center of a deadly game, where every decision could lead to a life of power or ruin. What else could he lose by trying to hold on to his inheritance, and what would he gain by simply leaving it all behind? At the most tense moment of his journey, Luke received the revelation that would change everything. The battle for the inheritance, which until then he thought was a confrontation with external enemies, took on a new dimension. He discovered that the real enemy was not outside, but within his own family. The betrayal was coming from someone he trusted, someone close enough to manipulate events in his direction. The pain of the discovery was profound, more than any physical blow. The feeling of isolation took over Luke as he began to understand that he could no longer count on the people around him. The trust he had placed in those close to him was now in tatters. The dilemma was clear. Should he try to save what was left of his family, trust whoever remained, or face everything alone? The real battle for the inheritance was no longer about riches, but about broken loyalties, and Luke found himself at the center of a dangerous game, where the stakes were much higher than he had imagined. As Luke struggled to understand what to do with this new revelation, fate seemed to throw him in another direction. He had an unexpected encounter with a family member who had been distant until that moment, someone he would have never thought would have crucial information about what really happened. This character, a relative whom Luke had never known well, revealed secrets that seemed to have been hidden for years. What Luke discovered in that meeting was devastating. Edward's death had not been just a personal loss, but a fundamental piece in a much larger power play. His father, Edward, had planned all of this, including the challenges that Luke would face, as if his son's destiny had already been mapped out from the beginning. The inheritance was not just a financial prize, but the key to controlling something much larger. The truth was like an electric shock to Luke, who was now beginning to understand that the game was not just a material legacy, but a power that could shape the future of everyone around him. Faced with stark reality, Luke found himself confronted with his final choice. He could accept the power and wealth that the inheritance offered, with all the responsibilities and risks that would come with it, or he could give it all up, seeking a simpler life, without the constraints of his father's legacy. But he knew this choice wasn't just about the money, it was about who he would be from now on. Along his journey, he realized that his true struggle was not against external enemies, but against what he would become when he made that choice. The weight of deciding between power and freedom was overwhelming. The internal battle that had consumed him for so long seemed stronger now than ever. He finally realized that the decision he made would not only change his destiny, but the destiny of everyone around him. Luke's life would never be the same, and he knew there was no going back. The consequences of Luke's choice began to unfold quickly. When he decided to accept the inheritance, he knew that his life would never be the same. Threats that once seemed distant now became a constant presence, more powerful and more dangerous than he had imagined. The enemies that surrounded him, which he thought were only temporary obstacles, now appeared imposing. With influence and resources he could not ignore, every decision he made now seemed to drag him further down a path of no return. But at the same time, he realized that his choice was not just about the inheritance itself, it was about who he would become, and the future he wanted to build. The fight for wealth was just a reflection of an internal battle he was fighting with who he really was. He could no longer escape himself, and the real question was, what did he want to be? The weight of his choice fell not only on his life, but on the lives of those around him. With a heavy mind and the risks clearly in sight, Luke made the decision to claim the inheritance, but he did it more consciously than ever before. He knew he was now part of something much bigger than he could have imagined, a game of power, manipulation, and survival. The weight of the choice was unbearable, but he was determined to move forward. He no longer wanted to be just the son of billionaire Edward. He wanted to be someone on his own, someone who built his own story. Accepting the legacy meant more than just assuming wealth and status. It meant fighting for the right to be who he really was, to prove to everyone, including himself, that he could be more than the fate imposed on him. The real challenge now was knowing how to deal with the inheritance and the power that came with it. He could no longer just be a spectator in the lives of others. He needed to take the reins and become the protagonist of his own story. The power that Luke now possessed was much greater than he had imagined. Inheritance was not just a symbol of wealth. It came with immense responsibilities and dangers he had not anticipated. With every movement he made, he felt the weight of what was being asked of him. The wealth and status that once seemed to be the prize now proved to be a burden. The responsibilities were overwhelming and the risks infinite. The fight for the inheritance was just the beginning of an even bigger battle, where he would have to face not only his enemies, but the choices he would make along the way. He soon realized that power, like wealth, was not something one could easily control. There were lies, manipulation, and intrigue around every corner, and Luke knew that to survive in this world, he would have to be more cunning and more ruthless than he had ever imagined. The real battle for survival was just beginning. Luke found himself faced with a decision that challenged everything he believed. To maintain the power and wealth he had gained, he needed to make a profound personal sacrifice. The moral dilemma intensified every day. To secure his position, he began to realize that he needed to give up parts of his own humanity, renouncing values that he had always held as fundamental. The price for power seemed higher than he had imagined, and he wondered if it was really worth it. With each choice he made, a part of his soul seemed to be consumed by ambition and the need to ensure his survival in this merciless game. He wanted to be someone who deserved wealth, someone who had the right to rule his own life, but with each sacrifice, he distanced himself further. As the fight for the inheritance intensified, Luke came to understand that his true battle was not just for power, but for the truth. He knew that to have control over his own destiny, he would need to unmask the lies that had surrounded his life. He could no longer live under the shadow of ancient secrets and silent betrayals. The people who had used his name and heritage to achieve their own goals were now in his way, and he needed to confront them head-on. He discovered with regret that his family had hidden truths for so long, manipulating him and throwing him into a scenario where he was more a piece than a player. The fight for the inheritance, which initially seemed to be a matter of wealth, turned into a relentless search for the truth, something he could not ignore. If he wanted to truly control his life and his family's future, he would need to deeply understand what had been done in the name of his legacy. When Luke finally faced his enemies, he discovered the full truth about his father and the heritage that had tormented him. What he learned transformed him in profound ways. Edward, his father, had left more than just riches. He left a web of secrets, but by unraveling them, Luke finally understood what was really at stake. True wealth was not in money as he had thought, but in the knowledge he acquired along his journey. He understood that his father had prepared him for this moment, perhaps unintentionally, perhaps with the intention that he would make the right choices. The final revelation transformed him, and he now saw the future with new eyes. The power he sought was not just a right, but a responsibility. Now, he knew that true strength lay in the truth he had conquered, and that by mastering the secrets of the past, he could shape his own future. Luke, now more mature and aware of everything he had been through, sat alone in his office, reflecting on the journey that had brought him there. He looked at the legacy left by his father, the power and wealth he once desired, and pondered all he had learned. Every decision, every sacrifice, every revelation shaped him in a way he could no longer ignore. He knew that power would always have its price, but he also understood that he was more prepared than ever to face any challenge that came his way. He had found his true identity along this tortuous path, and now he knew that this was more valuable than any material inheritance. The riches, the status, the fame, none of these meant the same to him anymore. What really mattered was the knowledge of who he was and what he could be. He finally understood that by accepting his father's legacy, he was not becoming another pawn in this game, but rather the master of his own destiny. With all the pieces of the puzzle finally in place, Luke felt an inner peace that had previously seemed impossible. The decision he made wasn't easy, but now, looking back, he knew he was in control of his own life. The power plays, betrayals, and threats he had faced along the way had been difficult, but in the end, they only made him stronger. He had overcome adversity and now understood that true victory was not in accumulating wealth, but in gaining the freedom to make his own choices. Luke knew that regardless of what happened from then on, he was ready to face the next chapters of his life. The fear that once dominated him had now given way to unshakable confidence. He was no longer the lost son of a billionaire. He was a man forged by his own choices and achievements. As Luke looked to the future, he felt a new perspective forming within him. The journey was far from over, but now he knew he had the ability to shape it. He understood that the greatest inheritance he could have was not the fortune his father had left him, but the freedom to live on his own terms. True freedom was not in money or power, but in the ability to make decisions without being enslaved by the past or the expectations of others. With a sense of renewed confidence, he prepared himself for the challenges ahead, this time with the certainty that no matter the circumstances, he could always take control of his own destiny. And it was with this certainty that Luke, now at peace with himself, took the first step towards the future he would create. Thank you for following this far. If this journey has touched you and you feel ready to follow new paths, click to like the channel, and don't miss any of the stories that bring inspiration and transformation. On the final screen, we also have a recommended video with a similar story that will definitely move you even more. And to continue exploring stories of overcoming and learning, check out our collection of related videos. Just click and delve even deeper into stories that can change your life. See you in the next video, where more stories of courage and decision await to touch your heart and light your path.